Introducing myself is always a bit tricky, especially when the story I'm about to tell you is one I've kept to myself for far too long. My name is Brian, and I've been a truck driver for almost 15 years. You might think it's a simple job, but the life of a long-haul trucker is filled with long stretches of lonely highways, the hum of the engine, and the occasional moment of terror. I've driven through blizzards, thunderstorms, and even the dead of night. But there's one particular night that still haunts me. A night I will never forget. A night that changed everything. It was late November when I got a call from my dispatcher about a last-minute load. "We need you to pick up a shipment from an old factory just outside of town. It's a tight deadline, so you'll have to head out tonight." "Sure, I'll take it," I replied, not thinking twice about it. I figured it would just be another routine run. But something about that factory didn't sit right with me. I'd heard the stories, the whispers about the place being haunted or cursed. But like any seasoned trucker, I brushed it off as just another urban legend. As I drove to the factory, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The excitement of making a quick load filled my mind. But the moment I turned down the road leading to the factory, a feeling of dread washed over me. The trees lined the path like sentinels, their branches clawing at the darkening sky. When I arrived, the factory loomed before me, a decaying relic from a bygone era. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling, leaving behind a ghostly facade. The flickering streetlights barely illuminated the entrance, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I parked my truck in the loading area and hopped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I pulled out my phone to check the address again, but there was no signal. Typical for this part of town, I thought. I made my way to the entrance, the wooden door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the factory was dark, with only a few flickering lights illuminating the vast space. Machinery lay scattered about, covered in dust and cobwebs. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, frozen in the past. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. No response, just the faint hum of electricity and the sound of my footsteps. I ventured deeper into the factory, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I finally spotted a few pallets stacked against the wall. That must be my load. I began unloading the boxes, a strange sensation prickling at the back of my mind. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the overwhelming silence and the oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a low groan echoing through the factory. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like it was coming from the far corner of the building. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice wavering. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination. "Get it together, Brian," I muttered under my breath. I continued loading the boxes onto my truck, but the unease settled deeper into my gut. As I loaded the last box, the groaning sound returned, louder this time, almost like a whisper. I paused, glancing around, the shadows feeling thicker. "Okay, this isn't funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the shadows. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my heart pounding, but the only response was the echo of my voice. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just the wind, the old factory settling, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I finished loading the last box and climbed into my truck, slamming the door shut behind me. The cab felt like a haven, but my mind was racing with thoughts. I started the engine, the rumble breaking the silence, and I prepared to pull out of the factory lot. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the factory, partially obscured by the shadows. My heart sank as I squinted into the darkness. The figure seemed to be watching me, unmoving. "Get a grip, Brian," I whispered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I put the truck in gear and slowly rolled out of the lot, glancing back one last time. The figure was still there, its face hidden in the shadows. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "It's just your mind playing tricks," I told myself as I drove away from the factory, the headlights illuminating the dark road ahead. But as I drove, the feeling of unease didn't fade. The highway stretched out before me, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure from the factory. Nothing, just the darkness of the road behind me. Hours passed as I drove. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. I took a deep breath, trying to relax. Maybe I was just tired. But as I approached a rest area, the feeling returned. I pulled in, hoping to grab a cup of coffee and shake off the unease. As I parked the truck, I noticed a few other vehicles scattered around. Mostly cars with their drivers fast asleep. I climbed out of the truck, stretching my legs as I made my way to the restrooms. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of pine. I walked to the vending machines, hoping to find something to snack on. Just as I reached for a candy bar, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see another truck driver, but the area was empty. My heart raced as I scanned the parking lot, the shadows feeling thick and suffocating. "Get it together," I muttered, shaking my head. I grabbed a soda and made my way back to the truck, feeling an unsettling sense of dread creeping in. I climbed back into the cab and locked the door, taking a deep breath. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at me. I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the silence. As I settled in, I noticed something on the dashboard, a small slip of paper. Confused, I picked it up, unfolding it carefully. It was a note, hastily written in shaky handwriting. "Leave now. You're in danger." My heart dropped as I scanned the parking lot again. Who had left this note? Had someone seen what happened at the factory? Just then I heard a tapping on the window. I froze, my blood running cold as I turned to see the figure from the factory standing outside my truck, its face still obscured by shadows. Panic surged through me, and I quickly fumbled for my keys, ready to start the engine. The figure moved closer, pressing its face against the glass, and I could finally see its features. Hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and skin that seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the light. I slammed the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I threw the truck into gear, my foot slamming down on the gas. I sped out of the rest area, heart racing, glancing in the mirrors as I felt the weight of something chasing me. The highway opened up ahead, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. But the fear remained, gnawing at me. I glanced back once more and caught a glimpse of the figure standing in the rest area, watching as I disappeared into the night. The miles melted away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and every rustle in the trees sent a jolt of panic through my body. I flipped through the radio stations, desperately trying to distract myself, but the static only amplified the tension. Hours later, I finally reached a small truck stop. It was almost dawn, and I was exhausted. I pulled into the lot, the flickering lights illuminating the entrance. As I stepped out of the truck, the cool air hit me like a slap. I felt a mix of relief and unease as I approached the building. The diner was open, and the smell of coffee wafted through the air. I needed to eat and gather my thoughts. I stepped inside, the bell chiming overhead. A few truckers were scattered around, and the waitress greeted me with a warm smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the anxiety clawing at my chest. "A cup of coffee and a breakfast special, please," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. As I sat at the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around the diner, noticing the truckers whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward me. It felt like they knew something I didn't. "Everything okay?" the waitress asked, placing my coffee in front of me. "Yeah, just a rough night," I said, forcing a smile. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a rough night. The encounter at the factory, the figure that had followed me, it was all too real, too terrifying. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation at the booth behind me. The truckers were talking about disappearances in the area. "I swear, there's something out there," one of them said. "People go missing after stopping at that old factory." My stomach dropped as I listened, the pieces falling into place. I wasn't the only one who had encountered something sinister. I had to get out of there. I paid my bill, hastily leaving a tip as I made my way back to my truck. As I stepped outside, I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows. But the parking lot was empty, the night air still and quiet. I climbed into the cab, locking the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I prepared to leave, my heart pounding in my chest. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, my breath hitching in my throat. In the distance, I could see the factory standing ominously against the horizon, a dark silhouette against the dawn sky. I put the truck in gear, my foot pressing down on the gas. I tore down the highway, the fear still clawing at my mind. As the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had encountered that night was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. So to anyone who drives at night or takes on those last-minute loads, be careful. Because sometimes the roads you travel lead you to places you wish you'd never gone. And some things are better left in the dark. If you have your own trucker horror stories, I'd love to hear them. Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's keep each other safe out there. I never planned to tell anyone about what happened that night. It's the kind of story that makes you question your sanity. Even now, months later, I sometimes lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every eerie detail over and over again. But no matter how many times I do, the feeling of dread doesn't go away. Maybe sharing it here will help. It started as a regular delivery route. I've been a trucker for over a decade, driving across the country and hauling freight from coast to coast. You see all kinds of things on the road. Weird stuff becomes normal after a while, like people standing on the side of the highway at 3 a.m. or abandoned cars in the middle of nowhere. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that lonely stretch of road. I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to a small warehouse in Kansas. It was a typical overnight run, about 6 hours, but the night was unusually quiet. The road stretched out in front of me like a black ribbon, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. The sky was moonless, and the stars seemed dim, almost like they were hiding. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I decided to pull over at a rest stop. I had been driving for hours without a break, and my eyes were starting to feel heavy. The rest stop was one of those small, isolated ones, the kind that only had a couple of picnic tables and a dingy bathroom. It wasn't a proper truck stop, but it was the only one for miles, so I figured I'd take a quick break, stretch my legs, and get back on the road. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching on the gravel, and parked next to an old beat-up sedan. The rest stop was eerily quiet, with no sign of other trucks or people. The only sound was the wind whistling through the nearby trees. It felt wrong, but I ignored the feeling and chalked it up to fatigue. I grabbed my thermos of coffee and stepped out of the truck. As soon as I got out, the uneasy feeling intensified. The wind seemed to die down, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off, walking toward the bathroom. It wasn't uncommon for remote places like this to feel unsettling, especially in the middle of the night. The bathroom was old, with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed loudly. The walls were covered in grime, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. I quickly used the toilet and washed my hands in the stained sink, trying not to look too closely at the mirror. Something about it just felt off. It wasn't just reflecting my image. I hurried out of the bathroom and back to my truck, but when I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The old sedan that had been parked next to my truck was gone. I hadn't heard an engine or seen any lights, and there hadn't been enough time for someone to just quietly slip away without me noticing. My truck was the only vehicle in the lot now, and the eerie silence was back, heavier than before. I quickened my pace, my heart thudding in my chest as I approached my rig. The cold wind picked up again, but it felt different, almost like it was whispering. That's when I heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. "Help me." I froze, straining to hear, but the voice was gone. It had been soft, almost like it was coming from far away. I glanced around the lot, but there was nothing, just the dark trees lining the edges of the rest stop. I told myself I was hearing things. The wind, the stress of the job, the loneliness of the road, it was all getting to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I climbed back into my truck, locking the door behind me. The cab felt safe, warm, and familiar. I told myself to calm down, took a sip of coffee, and glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearing 3 a.m., and I had a few hours left to drive before reaching my destination. I started the engine, eager to put that rest stop behind me. As I pulled out of the lot, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. I stared out the window, scanning the area where I thought I'd seen it, but there was nothing, just the swaying branches and the darkness beyond. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was just tired and seeing things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there watching me. I hit the gas and sped down the highway, my pulse still racing. The rest stop disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the night. I told myself it was all in my head, but the unease followed me, clinging to the back of my mind like a shadow. About an hour later, I saw something up ahead that made my blood run cold. There, On the side of the road was the same old beat-up sedan from the rest stop. It was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing weakly. I slowed down as I approached, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw the driver, a man slumped over the steering wheel. I pulled over, heart pounding in my chest, debating whether to get out and help. Something in me screamed not to. The entire situation felt wrong, but the man looked like he might be hurt, maybe even dead. I couldn't just drive past. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the truck and cautiously approached the sedan. The hazard lights blinked in the dark, casting eerie flashes of red across the pavement. As I got closer, I could see the man more clearly. He was motionless, his head resting against the window. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the night. "Sir," I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" No response. I moved closer, shining the flashlight into the car. That's when I noticed the blood. There was a dark smear across the man's shirt and more pooled beneath him. My heart sank. He wasn't hurt, he was dead. I backed away, my legs shaking. This wasn't normal. I needed to call the cops. I turned and ran back to my truck, fumbling for my phone. But as I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye. A figure standing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was tall, with long, thin limbs and a face that seemed wrong, distorted. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and it was watching me. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I yanked open the door and jumped into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the figure was gone. I floored the gas, tires screeching as I sped down the highway. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing chasing me. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a brightly lit truck stop and called the police. I told them about the man in the car, about the blood, but I left out the part about the figure in the woods. I wasn't about to sound crazy. The police found the car and confirmed what I already knew. The man was dead, but there was no explanation for the blood, and they never found any signs of foul play. It was like the man had just died for no reason. I haven't driven that route since. Every time I think about it, I get that same feeling of dread, like something is still out there, watching, waiting. And I can't shake the image of those glowing eyes in the woods. I don't tell anyone about that night, and I don't plan to. But now and then, when I'm on the road, I think I see something in the distance. A tall, thin figure, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Introducing myself is never easy, especially when I have a story that makes me question my sanity. My name is Rick, and I've been a long-haul truck driver for the last decade. I've seen the country from behind the wheel, through sunrises and sunsets, snowstorms and heat waves. But it's the nights that stand out the most. Nights spent on desolate highways where silence reigns and the darkness feels alive. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of night that felt like it stretched on forever. I had just picked up a load in Texas, bound for a small distribution center in Arkansas. The plan was simple: drive through the night, deliver the goods in the morning, and grab a hot meal along the way. Little did I know that this night would turn into a chilling experience I'd never forget. As I hit the road, I switched on my favorite podcast, something about urban legend. The host had a captivating way of recounting stories, and I found myself hooked, the eerie tales filling the cabin of my truck with an unsettling ambiance. The highways were mostly empty, just me, my truck, and the occasional deer darting across the road. Hours passed, and I was approaching a stretch of highway known for its isolation. The kind of place where your mind starts playing tricks on you, and every rustle in the bushes sends chills down your spine. I felt the weight of fatigue creeping in, but I pushed through, cranking the volume on the podcast to drown out my drowsiness. It was around midnight when I noticed something strange. A flickering light appeared on the side of the road, just ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a small diner, the neon sign sputtering and buzzing. Open 24 hours, it read, though the words felt more like a warning than an invitation. I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. The diner looked almost abandoned, but the light inside was on, and I could see the outline of a figure moving behind the counter. My stomach grumbled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since lunch. As I entered, the door let out a soft chime, and the smell of greasy food filled the air. A woman stood behind the counter, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She wore an old diner uniform that looked like it had been in service since the 1970s. "Welcome," she said with an enthusiastic smile, but her eyes held a strange glimmer that made me uneasy. "Hey there," I replied, trying to shake off the odd feeling. "Just looking for a bite to eat. What do you recommend?" "Everything's good here," she said, her smile widening. "You can't go wrong with a burger and fries." I took a seat at the counter, the faux leather sticking to my skin. As I waited for my food, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the diner was. The only sounds were the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional clink of dishes. I glanced around, taking in the faded photographs on the walls, images of families, smiling faces, and a few old newspaper clippings. "Here you go," she said, placing a plate in front of me. The burger looked greasy and delicious, and I dug in immediately, savoring the taste. But as I chewed, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure stood outside, partially obscured by the diner's neon glow. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the trees swaying in the wind. "Everything okay?" the woman asked, her gaze following mine. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," I replied, feeling a bit embarrassed. "You know how it is out here at night," she said, leaning in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "People go missing sometimes, just disappear without a trace." I forced a chuckle, but her words sent a shiver down my spine. "That's a bit ominous, don't you think?" "It's just the truth," she said, her expression unchanging. "You can never be too careful out here." I finished my meal quickly, the urge to get back on the road becoming overwhelming. "Thanks for the food," I said, tossing some cash on the counter. "I need to get going." "Be safe out there," she replied, her smile still fixed, but her eyes betraying a hint of something darker. As I stepped back into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I climbed into my truck and started the engine, glancing in the mirrors before pulling out of the parking lot. The diner's lights faded behind me as I merged back onto the highway. Not long after, I hit a stretch of road that felt even lonelier than before. The trees closed in on either side, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers against the night sky. I turned up the podcast again, trying to drown out the unsettling silence. But then something caught my eye. A flash of light in the rearview mirror. I looked back and saw headlights approaching rapidly. I frowned, noting that they seemed to be swerving erratically. I couldn't tell what kind of vehicle it was, but it was coming up fast. As it drew closer, I realized it was a pickup truck, its headlights blinding in the darkness. The driver was weaving in and out of the lane, as if they were struggling to maintain control. My heart raced as I watched it draw nearer, adrenaline kicking in. I didn't want to get involved, but I also didn't want to leave someone in danger. Suddenly, the truck swerved off the road and disappeared into the trees. I slammed on my brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell just happened? I debated whether I should turn back, but the thought of getting out there in the dark, surrounded by who knows what, made my skin crawl. After a moment of hesitation, I pressed on. The road felt eerily silent, my mind racing with thoughts of the driver. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just being reckless, or maybe they were just as lost as I was. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but it was all static. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. My eyes darted from the road to the mirrors, half expecting to see that truck reappear. Just as I thought I had put the incident behind me, I noticed something in the distance. A figure standing on the side of the road. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. A woman, drenched in the shadows of the trees, waved her arms as if trying to flag me down. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but I couldn't just leave her there. I pulled over, my heart racing as I rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaky. She approached slowly, illuminated by the dim glow of my headlights. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. "Please help me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I was in an accident, and I can't find my friend." I felt a surge of sympathy, but a part of me was still wary. "Where is your friend?" I asked, scanning the trees behind her. "In the truck," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, we need to go back." Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed from the wood. I jumped, my heart racing as I looked toward the sound. "What was that?" I demanded, suddenly feeling very small in my truck. She turned, panic filling her eyes. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." I hesitated, unsure whether to trust her. "You need to tell me more," I said, my voice firm. "What happened?" "We were driving and something came out of the trees," she said, her breath hitching. "It was huge and fast, and then we crashed. My friend is still in the truck." Before I could process her words, another crash erupted from the woods, this time closer. My instincts kicked in, and I made a decision. "Get in," I said, my voice low. She climbed into the passenger seat, her hands shaking. "Please, you have to help us." I hit the gas, feeling a surge of adrenaline as I sped down the road. The last thing I wanted was to be caught out here with whatever that thing was. "What do you mean, help us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease in my gut. "Where's your truck?" "Just a little further down the road," she said, glancing nervously at the trees as we passed. "Please, hurry." As we drove, I could feel a presence looming in the darkness, as if the shadows were alive and watching us. My heart raced with each passing moment, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The road was a blur, and all I could think about was getting her to safety. Finally, we approached a clearing. In the dim light, I saw the wrecked pickup truck, its frame twisted and crumpled against the trees. "That's it!" she shouted, pointing. "My friend is still inside." I pulled over, my heart pounding. "Stay here," I ordered, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "I'll check it out." She nodded, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. I stepped out of the truck, the night air thick with tension. As I approached the wreck, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. "Hello," I called out, shining the flashlight into the truck. "Is anyone in there?" No response. My stomach churned as I moved closer, peering into the shattered windows. The interior was empty, but something felt off. The seat was stained with something dark, and the ground around the truck was disturbed as if something had dragged itself away. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the trees again, followed by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I felt rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. Then I heard it, a voice calling from the shadows. "Help me!" It was a male voice, panicked and desperate. My heart raced as I turned back toward the truck, calling out, "I'm coming!" But just as I started to make my way toward the sound, I saw the woman's eyes widen in horror. "No, don't go!" I hesitated, my heart pounding as the growling grew louder and closer. The shadows seemed to shift, and I could feel something watching me, lurking just beyond the light. "Rick, please!" she cried out. "We need to leave now." That snapped me back to reality. I sprinted back to my truck, adrenaline fueling my every step. "Get in!" I shouted, and she scrambled to the passenger seat as I jumped behind the wheel. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The growling intensified, echoing around us as I put the truck into gear and sped away. The trees blurred past, the darkness closing in behind us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart racing as I saw a figure darting between the trees, its movements fast and unnatural. "Who the hell was that?" I gasped, my mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know," she yelled, her face pale with fear. "Just drive!" I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as we tore down the road. The figure seemed to keep pace with us, its shadow flickering in and out of sight. The fear coursed through my veins, making it hard to think straight. "What do we do?" I shouted, my eyes glued to the road ahead. "Just get to town," she pleaded. "We'll be safe there." But as we continued down the dark highway, I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on us, the shadows creeping closer. The darkness felt alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing us. As we rounded a bend, the lights of a small town finally appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me, but just as quickly, it was replaced by a sense of dread. The growling seemed to fade, but I could still feel its presence lurking just out of sight. I sped into town, my heart racing, and finally pulled into a gas station, the flickering lights of the sign a welcome sight. "Get out!" I shouted, and we both jumped from the truck, sprinting toward the door. We burst inside, the bell jingling as we entered. The clerk looked up, startled. "What's going on? Call the police!" I shouted, breathless. "We need help!" The woman stood next to me, shaking as she tried to catch her breath. "There's something out there," she gasped. "It's been following us." The clerk eyed us suspiciously, but reached for the phone. I glanced out the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The night was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The clerk spoke into the phone, his voice tense. "We have 2 individuals here claiming they're in danger. Yes, they're at the gas station." Just then, the lights flickered, and I caught a glimpse of movement outside. My heart raced as I pressed my face against the glass. "It's coming!" I shouted. The woman screamed, and I felt panic surge through the room. "Get back!" I yelled, pushing her behind me as the door swung open with a creak. The figure stepped inside, cloaked in shadows, its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by darkness. I stepped back, my heart pounding as I realized we had nowhere to go. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a grin stretching across its face, revealing sharp teeth. "You shouldn't have left the diner," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "Rick, what is that?" the woman whispered, terror written all over her face. But before I could respond, the clerk lunged forward, brandishing a baseball bat he'd grabbed from behind the counter. "Get away from them," he yelled, swinging the bat at the figure. It dodged effortlessly, moving with an unnatural speed, and I realized we were dealing with something far beyond comprehension. My mind raced as I glanced around the gas station, searching for anything we could use to defend ourselves. The figure lunged at the clerk, and I watched in horror as it grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground. The clerk gasped, his face turning red as he struggled to break free. I knew we had to act fast. "Grab the fire extinguisher," I shouted to the woman, who was frozen in fear. She nodded, snapping out of her daze, and rushed to the wall. She grabbed the extinguisher, her hands trembling as she pointed it at the figure. "Let him go," I shouted, my voice filled with desperation. The figure turned its attention to us, its eyes narrowing. I could see the malice in its gaze as it released the clerk, who crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. "Now!" I yelled, and the woman squeezed the handle, spraying foam everywhere. The figure recoiled, howling in rage as it was obscured by the white mist. I took the opportunity and lunged forward, grabbing the clerk and dragging him behind the counter. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. But the figure wasn't done. It burst through the foam, its form twisted and grotesque. The growl returned, deep and menacing, echoing through the gas station. "Go now!" I yelled at the woman as we made a break for the door. We pushed past the counter, rushing outside into the night. The darkness loomed around us, and I could hear the figure crashing through the station behind us. The woman and I sprinted for my truck, the engine still running, the headlights illuminating the way. I fumbled with the keys as we reached the door, finally getting it open and jumping inside. "Drive!" she shouted, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as we sped away from the gas station. I glanced back in the mirror, and to my horror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the lot, its eyes glowing in the darkness. "What the hell was that thing?" the woman gasped, her face pale. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking, "but we need to get as far away from here as possible." We drove through the night, my heart still racing from the encounter. The town faded into the distance, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. But deep down, I knew that something was still out there, lurking in the shadows. As we drove into the dawn, the first light of morning breaking through the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never be the same. The road ahead seemed endless, a reminder that danger lurked in the darkest corners, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. As I glanced at the woman beside me, her expression one of disbelief and terror, I knew I couldn't share this experience with anyone. Who would believe us? So I kept it to myself, the haunting memories of that night forever etched into my mind, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can be found when you're alone on the road. If you're a truck driver, take my advice. If you see a diner in the middle of nowhere, keep driving, because some places are better left undiscovered. I never thought being a truck driver would lead me to an experience that would haunt me forever. I've driven countless miles across this country, passing through all kinds of towns and cities, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that fateful night. It was late November and the cold had settled in. I was on a long stretch of I-40, heading east toward Tennessee. I'd just made a delivery in Albuquerque and was making my way back to the company's main terminal in North Carolina. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you question if you're truly alone. The only sounds were the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the tires humming against the asphalt. After a long day, I felt exhaustion creeping in, and my eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile. I turned up the radio, hoping the music would keep me alert, but the late-night country tunes were not doing the trick. My mind started to wander, replaying old memories and regrets, when suddenly, a flash of lights caught my attention in the distance. At first, I thought it was another truck, but as I got closer, I realized it was an old service station, its neon sign flickering sporadically. It was nearly midnight, and the place looked abandoned, but the lights were on. I pulled in, figuring a quick break wouldn't hurt. Maybe they had coffee, or at least a snack. As I stepped out of my truck, The cold air hit me like a slap. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter around me. The service station was eerily quiet. I walked toward the door, and it swung open with a loud creak, as if it hadn't been used in years. Inside, the dim lighting revealed a small convenience store, shelves stocked with dusty cans and expired snacks. The smell of old grease lingered in the air. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting odd shadows that danced along the walls. I moved further in, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. I walked up to the counter, hoping for some sign of life. That's when I saw him, an old man sitting in a booth in the corner, hunched over a cup of coffee. He looked like he had been there for ages, a wrinkled face framed by a scruffy beard. His eyes met mine, and he smiled, revealing a set of crooked teeth. "Evenin', traveler," he croaked, his voice raspy. "What brings you to this part of the world?" "Just passing through," I replied, trying to sound friendly. "Thought I'd grab a snack and some coffee." "Best coffee in town," he said, chuckling to himself. "Just don't drink it too fast. It'll wake you up quicker than you want." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. "Right," I said, pouring myself a cup. As I took a seat across from him, I noticed something odd. The walls were plastered with newspaper clippings, all yellowed with age. The headlines caught my eye: "Missing person found dead," "Local girl disappears without a trace," and "Haunting on the old highway." My heart raced as I scanned the articles, each one detailing tragic stories from this area. "Sad, isn't it?" the old man said, his voice breaking my train of thought. "This highway takes a lot of people. Some never come back." I forced a smile, but the unease was creeping back in. "Yeah, it's a dangerous road." "Not as dangerous as this place," he said, leaning in closer, his eyes narrowing. "You should leave before it's too late." "Too late for what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. But before he could respond, the front door swung open, and a woman walked in. She looked disheveled, her hair tangled and her clothes torn. Her eyes darted around the room, panic etched on her face. "Help me!" she shouted, rushing toward us. "Please, you have to help me." My heart raced. I stood up, ready to assist her, but the old man raised a hand to stop me. "Don't," he said, his voice firm. "It's too late for her." "Too late? What do you mean?" I asked, confusion washing over me. The woman reached us, breathless and trembling. "They're coming! You have to let me hide." "Please!" I glanced back at the old man, whose expression was now grave. "You don't know what you're getting into," he warned. Ignoring his words, I looked at the woman. "Who's coming? What's going on?" Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and I heard a low growl outside. My heart pounded as I moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass. In the darkness, I saw shadows moving among the trees, figures creeping closer. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Get away from the window!" the old man shouted, but it was too late. The woman grabbed my arm, her grip like iron. "We have to go!" Before I could react, the door burst open, and a group of figures stormed in, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. They moved quickly, surrounding us, and I could feel panic rising within me. "Get her!" one of them shouted, lunging toward the woman. In an instant, chaos erupted. I swung my arm to push her out of the way, but one of the hooded figures grabbed me, dragging me backward. The old man shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. I fought against their grip, but they were too strong. "Help!" I screamed, looking for any sign of assistance, but the old man had vanished into the shadows, leaving me to face the unknown. The last thing I saw was the woman being pulled away, her screams echoing in my ears. They dragged me outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I kicked and struggled, but they were relentless. I looked around frantically, trying to find a way to escape, but the figures formed a tight circle around me. "Let me go," I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. One of the figures stepped forward, pulling down his hood. A twisted grin spread across his face, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. "You've wandered into the wrong place, friend. This is our territory now." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you want from me?" "We're taking you for the initiation," he replied, his voice dripping with malice. "You're going to be one of us." Panic surged through me as I realized I had walked straight into a trap. "No, you can't do this," but my pleas fell on deaf ears. They shoved me to the ground, and I felt the cold earth beneath me as they closed in. I couldn't see the woman anymore, and the realization hit me. She was just another victim, just like the ones in the newspaper clippings. As they prepared to drag me away, I felt something shift inside me. The fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I knew I had to escape. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I pushed against the ground, breaking free from their hold and sprinting toward the tree line. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran blindly into the darkness, branches scratching at my face and arms, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind me. I could hear their angry shouts, the pounding of their footsteps growing closer. I stumbled through the woods, my breath ragged and heart pounding. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle made me jump. I was in the thick of it now, lost and terrified. The woods were a labyrinth, and I had no idea which way led to safety. I ran for what felt like hours, the adrenaline keeping me going. Then I saw a faint light in the distance, a flickering glow that promised hope. I sprinted toward it, praying it was a way out. As I got closer, I realized it was a small cabin, lights glowing warmly from the windows. I banged on the door, desperation rising within me. "Please, let me in." A moment later, the door creaked open and an elderly woman appeared. Her eyes widened in shock. "What happened? Please, I need help." "They're coming for me," I gasped, pushing past her into the cabin. "Who's coming?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Those people from the service station." "They're after me." The old woman's expression turned serious. "You shouldn't have gone there," she warned. "They don't take kindly to intruders." Suddenly, I heard shouting outside and my heart sank. They had found me. I felt the panic rise again as I turned to the woman. "We have to hide. They'll kill me." Without a word, she motioned for me to follow her to the back of the cabin. She opened a trapdoor leading to a basement and gestured for me to go down. I didn't hesitate, scrambling down the stairs into the dark. The basement was cold and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes. I crouched in a corner, my heart pounding as the sounds of shouting grew louder outside. I heard the door slam open, and the figures stormed into the cabin. "Find him!" one of them yelled. "He couldn't have gone far." I held my breath, praying they wouldn't check the basement. I could hear them moving around, searching every nook and cranny. The old woman's, "I can't share this experience with anyone. Not my friends, not my family, and certainly not my co-workers at the truck depot. I'm afraid of what they'd think if I told them the truth about what happened that night." It's a story I've kept locked away, buried deep in the corners of my mind. But now, I think it's time to let it out. I've been a long-haul truck driver for over 5 years. I've driven through rainstorms, blizzards, and everything in between. I'm no stranger to the strange occurrences that sometimes happen on the road, but nothing prepared me for the night I delivered a load to an abandoned warehouse on Highway 52. It was late October, and the air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. I had just finished a delivery in a small town and was on my way back to the depot when I received a call from my dispatcher. "Hey Mike," he said, his voice crackling through the radio. "We need you to make a quick drop-off at the old warehouse on Highway 52. You remember where that is?" "Yeah, I know it," I replied, a chill running down my spine. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, ever since the factory closed down. It was a place rumored to be haunted, where strange noises were often heard at night. "Great," he said, oblivious to my unease. "Just drop off the load and get back to the depot. Shouldn't take more than an hour." "Sure thing," I said, but as I drove down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The road was empty, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. I turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but nothing could shake the growing sense of dread that settled in my gut. As I approached the warehouse, I saw it looming in the distance, like a shadow against the night sky. The structure was decrepit, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. I parked my truck in front of the main entrance, the engine rumbling to a stop. Stepping out, I was hit by a blast of cold air. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The moonlight barely penetrated the darkness surrounding the building, and I felt an uneasy sensation wash over me. "Just drop off the load and get out," I muttered to myself, trying to quell my rising anxiety. I opened the back of my truck, revealing the boxes I was delivering. They were filled with old machinery parts and leftovers from the factory days. I grabbed a dolly and wheeled the first box toward the entrance, the wheels squeaking against the pavement. As I approached the door, I noticed a strange noise coming from inside the warehouse. It sounded like whispering, a faint, eerie murmur that sent chills down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, looking back at my truck, but I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a silly rumor get in the way of my paycheck. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly on its rusty hinges. The darkness inside was suffocating, and the whispering grew louder, swirling around me like a ghostly wind. I shone my flashlight into the shadows, illuminating the place filled with dust and debris. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. Is anyone here? Silence answered me, but the whispering continued, a low and unintelligible sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly set down the dolly and began unloading the boxes, trying to focus on the task at hand. As I moved deeper into the warehouse, the whispers grew clearer, taking on a more urgent tone. Get out, they seemed to say, echoing in my mind. I paused, my heart racing. Okay, this is ridiculous, I said to myself. It's just an old building. Just finish up and go home. I grabbed the last box and wheeled it toward the back of the warehouse, where a flickering light caught my eye. It was coming from a small office in the corner, the door slightly ajar. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, casting strange shadows on the walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way over. The whispering had turned into frantic voices, a cacophony of panic that made my skin crawl. I hesitated at the door, but I couldn't ignore it. Pushing the door open, I was met with a scene that made my blood run cold. The office was filled with old photographs and dusty papers strewn about, but the most disturbing sight was the wall, covered in scratched-out messages and symbols, some of which looked like desperate pleas. "Help us," one message read, barely legible beneath layers of grime. "They won't let us go." My heart raced as I stepped further inside, the voices growing louder. "Get out!" they screamed, an overwhelming sense of urgency filling the air. I turned to leave, but something stopped me in my tracks. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows. I could make out a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "Help us," it whispered, reaching out with a skeletal hand. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. "No, get away!" I shouted, turning to run. The voices erupted into a frenzy, a chorus of tortured souls urging me to leave. I sprinted out of the office, heart pounding, and grabbed the dolly, racing toward the entrance. The whispers became a deafening roar as I pushed open the door, throwing myself into the night. I didn't look back as I ran to my truck, fumbling to open the door. I jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the roar of the truck drowning out the voices behind me. I peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. As I drove away, I could see the warehouse fading into the darkness behind me, but the whispers lingered in my mind, echoing my name. I don't remember the drive back to the depot. My thoughts were clouded with fear, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. All I knew was that I had to get away from that place. When I finally pulled into the depot, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I parked my truck and sat there for a moment, the engine still running. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale figure staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the dim glow of the depot lights. I stepped out of the truck, my legs shaky as I made my way inside. The familiar sounds of the depot surrounded me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. My coworkers were busy chatting and laughing, completely oblivious to the terror I had just experienced. I forced a smile, trying to blend in, but the weight of the night pressed heavily on my chest. "Hey Mike, how was the drop?" one of my coworkers asked, clapping me on the back. "Just another night," I replied, my voice betraying my unease. "Long nights are the worst," he said with a chuckle. "At least you're back safe." I nodded, but inside I was screaming. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want anyone to know what I had seen. I went home that night and tried to forget. I turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the memories of the warehouse and the tortured souls trapped within its walls. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the whispers. Days turned into weeks, and I went back to my routine of long hauls and late nights. But the experience haunted me. I found myself avoiding Highway 52, taking longer routes just to steer clear of that cursed place. One night, I had just finished a delivery and was heading back to the depot when I noticed the familiar sign for Highway 52. My heart raced as I felt a pull toward it, as if something was drawing me back. I fought the urge to take the exit for the freeway, but as I drove, I felt a sense of loss. I hadn't confronted my fears, and I knew deep down that I needed to face whatever haunted me. So against my better judgment, I found myself back on Highway 52 one night. The road was empty, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the asphalt. I drove slowly, my heart pounding as I approached the abandoned warehouse once again. As I parked in front of the building, memories flooded back, the whispers, the figure in the corner, the feeling of dread. I sat in the cab for a moment, trying to gather my courage. "Just go in," I muttered to myself. "Face it head on." I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at my skin. The building loomed above me, dark and foreboding. but I felt a strange sense of determination. I walked toward the entrance, heart racing, and pushed open the door. The familiar creak echoed in the silence. I felt the whispers wrap around me again, this time softer, more mournful. Help us, help us. I walked deeper into the warehouse, guided by the sound. The office door was ajar, and I could see the flickering light spilling out. I hesitated, but this time I stepped inside. The walls... It was the kind of night that creeps into your bones. I was cruising down a long, deserted highway, the truck's engine humming a monotonous lullaby. I've been a long-haul trucker for years, driving across the country, and I thought I'd seen it all. But that night, something changed in me. Something snapped. I had just finished a delivery in Chicago and was en route to a distribution center in Louisiana. The load was unremarkable, boxes of household goods, but the night was heavy with an unusual stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees lining the road. It was the kind of night when your mind started to play tricks on you. The feeling of being watched crept up on me, but I dismissed it. About 2 hours into my drive, I passed a small roadside diner, its neon lights flickering in the distance. It was nearly empty, just a few truckers sitting at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. As I pulled in, I felt the weight of fatigue settling on my shoulders. I needed a break. I parked my rig, climbed out, and stretched my legs, feeling the chill of the night air biting at my skin. I made my way inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The smell of burnt coffee and greasy food hit me like a wave. I took a seat at the counter, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, approached me. "Coffee?" she asked, already pouring a cup before I could respond. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Long night?" she asked, her voice low. "Just another day on the road," I said, trying to sound casual. She nodded, but her eyes flickered to the window. I turned to see what she was looking at, but all I saw was the empty parking lot and the trees swaying in the wind. "You be careful out there," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "There's been talk of something strange happening on the highways lately." "Strange?" I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "What, like aliens?" She shot me a hard look. "No, I mean real strange. People disappearing. Some drivers say they've seen things out there." "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Figures in the trees, shadows that follow you." "Just be careful," she warned, her eyes shifting back to the window. I brushed it off as small-town superstition, but her words lingered in my mind as I finished my coffee and paid the bill. I climbed back into my truck and hit the road again, the diner's lights fading into the night. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and the trees loomed ominously. My radio crackled with static, and I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a station that didn't make me feel like I was the only person left in the world. After a while, I began to relax again, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt lulling me into a trance. That's when I saw the headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was another truck, but as it got closer, I realized it was a dark SUV, tailing me way too closely. I flicked my turn signal on and pulled over, hoping they'd pass. But instead, they slowed down too, matching my speed. I glanced in the side mirror, and my stomach dropped. The driver's face was obscured in shadow, but I could see they were staring straight at me. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but they accelerated too, staying right on my tail. Panic set in. I punched the gas, the truck roaring as I tried to put distance between us. The highway twisted and turned, but the SUV was relentless, weaving in and out of traffic. I took a sharp turn off the highway, heading onto a back road, my heart racing. I needed to lose them. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the trees closing in around me, until I saw an old, run-down gas station in the distance. I pulled in, hoping to find some sanctuary. I parked and jumped out of the truck, looking around. The station was dark, the pumps long out of service. It felt abandoned, but I had nowhere else to go. I turned around to check the road, and that's when I saw the SUV pull up. My heart sank. The driver stepped out, a tall figure in a dark coat, his face still hidden in shadows. He walked toward me, his movements deliberate and slow. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound brave. "What do you want?" "Your cargo," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Hand it over." "Cargo? It's just boxes," I stammered, backing away slowly. "You can't just take it." "Not the boxes," he said, taking another step closer. "The thing inside." Suddenly, everything clicked. The uneasy feeling I had earlier, the warnings from the waitress, and now this man demanding something that wasn't there. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. "Get back!" I shouted, reaching for the pocket knife I kept in my jacket. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he grinned, revealing a set of sharp teeth. "I'll take what I want," he said, lunging at me. I barely had time to react. I turned and sprinted back toward my truck, fumbling with the door handle as I scrambled inside. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart racing as I glanced at the figure outside. He was standing by the gas pumps now, staring at me, waiting. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Panic washed over me as I looked around, searching for something, anything, to defend myself. That's when I saw it, a rusty metal pipe lying on the ground next to the cab. I grabbed it, gripping it tightly. The figure moved again, this time closer to the truck. He looked almost amused, as if he enjoyed the game we were playing. "You can't hide forever," he taunted. With every passing second, the dread gnawed at me. I needed to get out of there. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the gas station, gravel flying behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to be right behind me, but he was gone. I drove for miles, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. I was alone in the dark, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on me. Hours passed, and the road stretched endlessly ahead. The shadows danced on the edges of my headlights, and the unease returned, sinking its claws into my gut. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. Then out of nowhere, my headlights illuminated something ahead, an old, abandoned house. The structure loomed in the night, windows boarded up, a faded for sale sign creaking in the wind. I pulled over, thinking I might find some help or a place to wait out the night. The air was thick with silence, but I stepped out of the truck anyway, clenching the metal pipe like a lifeline. I approached the house, heart pounding, and knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I felt compelled to check it out. I opened the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the smell of decay. The dim light from my truck cast eerie shadows on the walls, revealing old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. I moved cautiously through the rooms, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. It felt like a scene from a horror movie. I half expected something to jump out at me. In the back of the house, I found a staircase leading to the basement. The darkness below was unsettling, but I was desperate for safety. I crept down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest, the pipe gripped tightly in my hand. As I reached the bottom, I noticed a faint light flickering in the corner. My stomach twisted as I approached, the air growing colder. It was a small room, the walls lined with old newspapers and strange symbols scrawled in what looked like blood. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from the darkness. My instincts kicked in, and I turned to run, but something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, the pipe slipping from my grasp as I struggled against whatever had a hold on me. I glanced back and my blood ran cold. The figure from earlier was there, standing in the doorway, eyes glowing with malice. "I told you," he hissed, pulling me deeper into the shadows. "Your cargo is mine." I screamed, clawing at the floor, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed me whole, and all I could think about was how I should have listened. The shadows had come for me, and I was powerless to escape. I don't know how long I was lost in that darkness. I can't remember much, just the feeling of being dragged, the whispering voices that filled my head, and the weight of fear that pressed down on me. When I finally came to, I was back in my truck, the sun rising on the horizon. The sound of the engine was comforting, but as I looked around, I realized I was parked on the side of the road, miles away from where I'd been. I never intended to become a trucker, but life takes unexpected turns. One moment, I was working a dead-end job in a factory, and the next, I found myself behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler delivering goods across the country. It was a lonely job, but it paid well, and the open road had its kind of freedom. That is until I encountered something that made me rethink everything about this life. It was a chilly night in late October, and I was driving down Interstate 70 somewhere in the heart of Ohio. The air was thick with the smell of impending rain, and the skies were overcast. My eyes were heavy, the fatigue of long hours on the road weighing down on me. I had already driven for over 10 hours, and I knew I needed to find a rest stop soon. As I continued down the highway, I spotted the flickering neon sign for Rest Stop 17, promising hot coffee, snacks, and a much-needed break. I pulled off the highway, navigating the winding road that led to the parking lot. The rest stop was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered here and there, their headlights dim against the thick fog that had settled in. I parked my truck and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath of the cool air. The rest stop looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 90s. The building was a faded yellow with peeling paint and flickering lights. It wasn't the most inviting place, but it would have to do. As I walked toward the entrance, I felt a strange chill creep up my spine. It wasn't just the cold air, something felt off. I shook it off as my imagination ran wild and pushed open the door. The dingy interior smelled of stale coffee and old grease, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Inside, there was a single employee behind the counter, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. He barely looked up as I approached. "What can I get you?" he grunted, his voice gravelly. "Just a cup of coffee, please," I replied, trying to shake off the unease I felt. "Black?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the coffee pot. "Yeah, that works." As he poured my coffee, I glanced around the small shop. A few tables were scattered about, but only one was occupied. A group of 3 young men, laughing loudly and playing cards. I could hear snippets of their conversation, but it all felt distant. Something about their laughter felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this place. "Here you go," the employee said, handing me my cup. "That'll be $2. I handed him a crumpled bill and walked over to a table in the corner. I took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste, but I needed the caffeine to keep me awake. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the group of young men. They were still playing cards, but now their laughter had turned into whispers. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their eyes flicked toward me, then back to each other. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Hey, old man!" One of the guys suddenly shouted, clearly trying to get the attention of the employee. "What's the deal with this place? It's creepy as hell." The employee grunted in response, not bothering to look up from his magazine. "Seriously, look at it. I feel like we're in a horror movie," the guy continued, laughter bubbling up again. "Yeah, man, it's like we're gonna get murdered or something." Another one chimed in, their voices dripping with mock fear. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my coffee, but I couldn't help but glance over again. One of them caught my eye, a tall guy with a scruffy beard. He smirked at me, and I quickly looked away, trying to brush off the strange tension building in my chest. After finishing my coffee, I decided it was time to hit the road again. I stood up, placing my empty cup on the table. As I turned to leave, I heard a loud crash from the back of the rest stop. The noise echoed through the building, and I paused, my heart racing. "What was that?" one of the young men asked, glancing nervously at his friends. "Probably just some old junk falling over," the tall guy replied, but there was an edge to his voice. I didn't want to stick around to find out, so I pushed through the door and stepped back into the cool night air. As I made my way to my truck, I felt the unease settle deeper in my gut. Something was off about the whole place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Climbing into my cab, I turned the key and let the engine rumble to life. I took one last look at the rest stop, half expecting to see the group of guys following me. But they remained inside, and the employee hadn't moved from his spot behind the counter. As I pulled back onto the highway, the fog thickened around me. I turned on my headlights, straining to see the road ahead. I pushed the speed up a little, hoping to get as far away from that rest stop as possible. After about half an hour, I finally felt like I could relax. The road stretched on before me, and I could hardly see the faint outline of trees on either side. The only sounds were the rumble of my truck and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. But then, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A pair of headlights appeared behind me, getting closer and closer. I glanced back, expecting to see another truck or maybe a car, but what I saw made my heart race. It was an old, beat-up pickup, swerving erratically behind me. The driver was hunched over the steering wheel, and the truck seemed to be moving in and out of its lane. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I picked up speed, but the truck behind me accelerated too. I could see the driver now, and my stomach twisted at the sight. His eyes were wide and wild, and he seemed to be grinning like a maniac. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I pressed my foot down harder, trying to put distance between us, but the pickup was relentless. It stayed right on my tail, its headlights blinding me. I could barely see the road ahead, and panic set in as I navigated the winding highway. I made a sharp turn, hoping to lose him, but he followed, his truck closing the gap. I glanced at the speedometer. It read 80 miles per hour. I had to get away. Suddenly, the pickup swerved hard to the left, and I felt a rush of wind as it attempted to overtake me. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to the right to avoid a collision. The pickup passed me, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the glow of my headlights. His smile had turned into a twisted snarl. Heart pounding, I took the next exit off the highway, desperate to shake him off my tail. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to escape. The road led into a dark, desolate stretch surrounded by thick trees. I thought I had lost him until I saw the headlights behind me again, creeping closer through the fog. I could hardly breathe as I barreled down the narrow road, the trees closing in around me. Out of nowhere, the pickup pulled alongside me, the driver leaning out of his window. I could see him more clearly now, and my blood ran cold. He was screaming something, but I couldn't hear him over the roar of my engine. His face was twisted in rage, and he looked like a man possessed. I slammed the accelerator down, weaving through the trees. I needed to find a way out. Up ahead, I saw a clearing and made a sharp turn, desperate for a chance to get away. The pickup followed suit, and I felt the panic rising in my throat. In the clearing, I spotted an abandoned shack. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was my only option. I swerved toward it, my tires screeching as I pulled to a stop. I jumped out of the truck and dashed toward the shack, heart pounding and adrenaline surging through me. I glanced back to see the pickup screech to a halt behind me. The driver climbed out, his movements erratic and frantic. I rushed inside the shack, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The inside was dark, filled with dust and cobwebs. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but there was no signal out there. I cursed under my breath, the weight of my fear settling in. I heard the sound of footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate. The driver was pacing in front of the door, muttering to himself. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath, listening for any sign of what he might do next. Then I heard him laugh, a low, chilling sound that echoed through the space. "You think you can hide from me?" he shouted. "You can't escape!" I felt a surge of panic, and I turned toward a window, peering out into the darkness. The fog had thickened even more, and I couldn't see a thing, just the faint outline of the pickup parked outside. Suddenly, the laughter,